Mercury in the third house is a placement that a lot of people find confusing or really interesting. So in this video, let's clarify and make it very simple and clear what it really means. And before starting, I just want to note that if you have Mercury in the third sign from your ascendant at a degree which is very similar to your ascendant's degree, then that Mercury will be having a lot of influence on your ninth house. So you would also want to consider the interpretations of Mercury in your ninth house as overtones. And conversely, if your Mercury is in the ninth sign from your ascendant at about the ascendant's degree, it will have a lot of effect on your third house. And so you will want to consider the interpretations that we're going to discuss in this video. In order to understand Mercury in the third house, let's start by understanding the third house. As you can see here, the third house is the part of the sky that is deep underground, but on the eastern side of it. And since it's part of the deeply underground sky, it signifies all the things that are deeply internal to our being, our feelings, our emotions. But since it's on the eastern side, it also signifies things pertaining to the self and things pertaining to physicality and tangibility. So when you put two and two together, you understand the root of what the third house symbolizes. It symbolizes the feelings that we have towards ourself. So that involves two things. It involves our self-motivation, the things that motivate us, and it involves the way that we are able to express ourselves tangibly, to make our internal concepts or motives realized and real. So, to be specific, the third house represents decision making, because the decision is the basis of the motivation. You decide that you want something, or you decide that you don't want something, you decide that something is good or bad, etc. And this implies two other very important things about the third house: confidence and independence. When you make your own decisions, you're independent. And when you make your own decisions, you have a lot of confidence in yourself. The third house also symbolizes our ambitions, the things that motivate us, the things that drive us, our hungers, our lusts, what we want. The third house also symbolizes self-focus, which has a spectrum between selfishness on the one side and self-worth and self-love on the other side. All of those things are impacted directly and strongly by the third house. Now, about the way the third house represents how we express our inner self, the third house represents strength, which is the ability to influence the external reality. The third house represents physical strength for sure, and it also represents strength in terms of commitment to decisions. So the third house also has a lot to say about whether or not you're focused or distracted. The third house has to do with your skills, your expertise, your talents, your ability to express accurately and effectively what you're thinking, what you're feeling. And finally, the third house has to do with contest, because it has to do with self, right? It's what's motivating the self. So when you put a bunch of self-motivated people together, they conflict with each other. So third house has to do with contest, and the people with whom we contest are equals, our peers, our siblings. So we want to understand Mercury in this third house, and we're almost ready to do that. But first, we should really just take a second to make sure we understand what Mercury symbolizes. The fundamental basis of everything that Mercury symbolizes is intellect. And intellect processes codes into patterns. So Mercury signifies communication, and it deals with languages and even numeric languages, any kind of language system, because language is the encoding of thoughts, feelings, ideas. Mercury symbolizes interaction, because that's what you do with language. You communicate, you interact. but also you interact and exchange with money. So Mercury signifies mercantilism, exchanging, trade, etc., being a merchant. Mercury therefore has to do with relationships between the parties. So it has to do with friendships and partnerships. And since Mercury has to do with friendship and relationship, it's therefore friendly, and it signifies friendly things, things that are easy, things that are agreeable. So it has to do with wit, relaxation, recreation, fun, youthfulness. Mercury, of course, is the planet that represents learning, because learning is simply the recognition and understanding of the patterns that you encounter in life. Mercury symbolizes organization, because organization means the ability to put things into efficient and effective patterns. That's why Mercury symbolizes neatness and cleanness. Mercury symbolizes symmetry, because symmetry is organization of things into good patterns. And because it signifies symmetry, it has to do with balance, equanimity, and also beauty. Mercury finally signifies dexterity and expertise, because it signifies the ability to achieve balance. Now, good job. You've fulfilled all of your prereqs and you're ready to enroll in the course on Mercury in the third house. How are we going to work this out? What does Mercury symbolize when it's in the third house? It's really simple now that we remember what Mercury symbolizes and what the third house symbolizes. All we have to do is put the two symbolisms next to each other and see where they link up, what they have in common. The most significant and fundamental link between Mercury and the third house is a confusing one, and this is why I opened the video by saying a lot of people are kind of confused about what Mercury in the third house represents, because Mercury is a balanced, symmetrical, neuter planet, gender neutral, whereas the third house is decisively masculine. So, the various things that Mercury represents will often not seem to go well with the various things that the third house represents. For example, Mercury represents finesse, dexterity, right? Whereas the third house represents forcefulness and strength. So finesse doesn't really seem to get along with force. Mercury signifies balance and equanimity, but the third house represents lust and decisive dedication. So the third house is very heavily biased towards and against things, what it likes and wants and what it doesn't like and doesn't want, whereas Mercury is very middling. And finally, Mercury is very friendly and easygoing. It likes to have recreation. But the third house is very driven and motivated, so it likes to have discipline. So these topics are going to interact in a kind of contentious way, and we're going to want to interpret that. But for now, it's enough to have just identified that these are the issues that are going on with Mercury sitting in the third house. We'll talk more about that in a second, but let's look at two other issues. These other ones are quite good, actually. So Mercury represents dexterity or expertise, and the third house represents skill or expertise. So that gets along really well. That links up really well. We'll want to think about that as well. And finally, Mercury has to do with friendship, right? Relationships, and the third house has to do with friends, because it has to do with the peers, potential friends, and siblings. So after you identify the real pulse or root or seed of what's going on with the planet in the house, then you can take more time to try to explore how that seed would grow and how you would interpret that seed. So let's first of all look at this pretty complex and deep one about Mercury being neuter and the third house being masculine. The way that this is interpreted is that Mercury in the third house indicates a middleness in the gender spectrum. And the way that that will exactly manifest for an individual will depend upon the rest of the conditions that Mercury in the chart has. But it basically and essentially means that the masculinity is toned down or dampened because the planet is not interested in utilizing the resources of this house. The resources of the house are masculine. The planet is interested in being neutered. So it's not interested in utilizing the masculinity of this house. So the result is that the masculine assets are underutilized. And some of the ramifications of that is that this person tends to be moderate. They tend not to be overly passionate or overly driven. And also, they tend to be non-initiating in how they pursue their objectives. Masculine nature is to immediately initiate the quest and the hunt and the search for what it wants. But if the maleness is dampened, then the initiative towards fulfilling one's desires is dampened, and instead one acts in a way to try to bring the desired objectives closer to us of their own accord, rather than us going to them. To bring up a very clear example of this dynamic, Boy George has Mercury in the third house. Not everybody with Mercury in the third house is Boy George. Why is Boy George Boy George? Why is he so male-dampened in such a literal way? Well, first of all, his third house is Cancer, which is a very feminine sign. So that's another domino falling against the masculinity, underutilizing the masculinity, dampening the masculinity. Another thing is that his Mercury in the third house, Cancer, is conjoined a feminine planet, the moon. Another thing is that he has a feminine planet rising in a feminine rising sign. He has Venus rising in Taurus. And the fourth thing and the final thing that I'll mention here is his Mercury in the third house is aspected strongly by Saturn, which is on the other gender-neutral planet. Now let's explore the second seed for Mercury in the third house. The fact that Mercury is dexterous and expert, and so is the third house. His third house is skillful, talented, and expert. So people with Mercury in the third house, this is a simple interpretation. These are talented people. What kind of talent? It's a certain kind of intellect. They're good at learning skills, and they're good at using skills, and they're good at expressing what they're thinking or what they're feeling or what they're imagining. So a very good example of this is Michelangelo. Michelangelo has Mercury in the third house. Why is Michelangelo? Not everybody is as intelligent and creative and expressive as Michelangelo, are they? Not everybody with Mercury in the third house is Michelangelo. Why is he so special? Well, first of all, his Mercury in the third house is conjoined Jupiter, the planet of philosophy and wisdom and learning. And it's in an air sign, Aquarius. Air signs are intellectual. And it's in its own Amsha, which is quite important. It's in the Gemini Amsha. It's in an airy Amsha as well. And Navamsha is Gemini. In addition to this, of one very important thing that makes Michelangelo so artistic is that his 11th lord is in the 5th house. If you've watched any of my videos, really, or some of my videos, you notice every time there's an artist, I always find this combination of 5, 11, and 3. Houses 5, 11, and 3. That's the signature for an extremely outstanding artist. So Michelangelo's case, the 11th lord is in the 5th house, while the 5th and the 3rd lords are exactly trying to each other. Now, the third and final seed for interpreting Mercury in the 3rd house is that Mercury has to do with friendship, and the 3rd house has to do with peers. So there's two things that are classically said about Mercury in the 3rd house which make sense in this regard. One thing is that they are a good sibling. In other words, they're not a selfish sibling or a competitive sibling, because that's been toned down by putting Mercury in this house. So they tend to be a cooperative or friendly, agreeable sibling. And in general, they're not selfish in their friendships. Another classic thing that's said about Mercury in the third house is that they like to work for the benefit of the needy. So they're charitable. So this is because their selfishness is toned down. And I think a good person to illustrate this is Oprah Winfrey. She has Mercury in the third house. And she's very generous. She's showing other people. She's not trying to show herself. She's a talk show host, so she's spotlighting other people, and she's very charitable, and she likes to give things away, and she forms charitable trusts and gives tons of money away. So why is this so true in her case? In her case, it's not just Mercury in the third house, but it's Mercury in the third house conjoined to the ninth lord, the sun. So the ninth house signifies all of those charitable and morality, etc. The ninth lord is conjoined Mercury in the third house, is going to bring out the charitable potential of Mercury in the third house. Also, her Mercury in the third house is completely, almost 100% aspected by Jupiter. Jupiter is a planet for morality, and morality has to do with charity. And finally, it's in Aquarius. And Aquarius has to do with reduction of selfishness and more focus on group identity. So these are the seeds and the basic interpretation of those seeds for Mercury in the third house. The exact way that each seed grows, as you can see from the three different examples, is slightly modified depending upon the soil of the rest of the chart and the conditions of Mercury in the third house. If you want to understand the whole context of your chart, the soil in which your interpretive seeds grow, then visit my website, vicdecara.com, and click Readings. My complete chart report explains each and every nook and cranny of your chart and will keep you occupied in self-discovery for years. I also have two groundbreaking new reports. The first of these, Your Nakshatra, organizes your active nakshatras in order of their importance to you and presents the fundamental interpretations for the planets that occupy them. And the newest report, Star Strength, uses a system called Tarahabala to unfold 90 interpretations of the nuanced relationships between all the planets in your chart, which paints a rich and detailed picture of how your various strengths cooperate or compete with each other. Order these or any of my reports and accelerate your journey to deeper self-understanding.